How old you? Oh, are we live now, or just?
Well, I can take this out. You can go ahead and ask.
No, I was just going to say, how long have you been married to your current wife?
We have been married. Well, we've been together for 10 years.
Gotcha.
She's a saint for putting up with me. God bless her,
Yeah.
and all this that I'm trying to do. All right, wrestling fans, I'd like to take this time to welcome to the show a guest that I am very happy to have with us this week. The one, the only, the co-host of Breaking Kayfabe with Bowden and Barry. You hear me talk about the show on our show, and I have plugged it on our Facebook group as well because it is. I'm not being full of shit when I say this. It's actually my personal favorite podcast. One of the co-hosts of the show, Mr. Barry Rose, is here with me this week. Welcome to the show, Barry.
I appreciate it, Nate. And the check is in the mail for saying that, by the way. So.
Oh yeah, thank you. And the cheeseburgers are in the mail for your appearance today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I would love that. Nothing would make me happier than a big fatty cheeseburger right now.
So. One of my other co-hosts, Archie Mitchell, is going to be angry with me because in his contract it states cheeseburgers. I am eluding his cheeseburgers from this week's pay and sending them to Mr. Rose. Barry, it is great to have you here. Great. Thank you for taking the time out to join me this week. Barry is not only the co-host of Breaking Kayfabe, but also the man behind the CWF Fan Fest. And that is something that I want to aim to get to sometime after COVID and all this is over with and we can get back to normal. But you want to tell everybody a little bit of your history as a wrestling fan, especially in Florida, because I do want to talk about Florida during the show. I'll put this in perspective. I was born in 1978. So I became a wrestling fan around the age of 5, 1983. Oh, guess what? The beginning of Hulkamania in the United States. So as a little dude, my first exposure to pro wrestling was obviously the WWF's national expansion, the WCW or NWA on TBS. Aaron and I grew up in Ohio, so once in a while we would get to watch the stuff from Detroit from the Sheik's Dying promotion at the time. And then as we grew up, of course, we're wrestling fans, 80s and 90s. So that tends to be obviously what we gravitate to here on the show. But as I got older, you start to expand. You start to think about, oh wow, I want to check this stuff out from Mid-South. I didn't even know Junkyard Dog wrestled here, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the promotions that I haven't seen a lot of, and it kind of fascinates me, is Florida. So I'm very, very happy to have you here. As someone who got to not only live through the territories, but live in a territory like that. Like for me, as a guy that never got to experience that, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I was really, it obviously it takes time to understand how fortunate you are. But the other aspect, which I'll tie in, is I grew up on a condominium directly on the beach. Mm-hmm. And I never understood how lucky I was and how fortunate I was until I was gone, until I was living in New York City, and I would try to describe it to people. And they would talk about their childhood and what they did. And I'd be like, I grew up literally on a beach in a condominium that overlooked the ocean. And then 2 to 3 times per week, I would also go to professional wrestling. Mm-hmm. And, when it was happening, because it's your daily routine, there's nothing unusual. You don't realize how fortunate you are. And then I'm in New York City and I'm hearing about people playing stickball between vacant, crack houses. And then I'm going, shit, I really was lucky. Like I really was. Now I can look back and obviously I realized, wow, I was really fortunate on so many levels. But, Florida was such a vibrant territory, such a compelling, exciting territory for professional wrestling going back to the 50s, really through the 80s. Until the promotion died in 87. And there was really a lot of reasons for it. First off, geographically located, you're in Florida. I mean, right. The weather is great. You can go to the beach or go swimming in the day in the pool, and you can go swimming in January. There are times when it can be cold, but at the same time, you could spend plenty of time, doing all these things that you couldn't do in the northeastern states. The other aspect was the territory wasn't the hardest territory to navigate. There were certain cities where you had to drive because Florida is it's a very long state. And then the third aspect were the women. Every territory had women that were, they were called ring rats, which I'm sure
Right.
you've heard the term before. But Florida had, arguably some of the hottest women, and still does, in the entire country. So this was very attractive for guys going down to work in Florida. But it was a vibrant territory. You would have 6 nights a week of wrestling, and then in about 77 they flipped on, and then Sunday they started wrestling on Sundays. But a lot of times you would get 2 cards per night.
Wow.
So, one single territory in one state might be putting on 12 shows, 12 cards per week.
Mm-hmm.
And television, there's another one right there. So we certainly had a lot of options. Where I grew up, and I grew up in an area called North Miami Beach, which literally was just north of what everybody knows as Miami Beach. And I could be at wrestling in Miami Beach in about 20 or 25 minutes. If I was fortunate enough and my dad or my friends wanted to go to West Palm, that was only an hour away. And then, Friday nights were in Fort Lauderdale. That was about 30 minutes away.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a lot of weeks where I was actually going to 3 cards per week, but the longest drive was only 1 hour.
See, and that's what I'm saying, where I'm jealous of guys that got to be in a territory during the territory times, because just to put it in perspective, I grew up in Toledo, Ohio.
My condolences on that, by the way.
So you got to go, okay, the WWF will be in Toledo or Detroit or maybe Fort Wayne, Indiana, once, twice a year. Maybe WCW will come through. They did not run Ohio very often, maybe during the Nitro time they did, but in the early 90s, late 80s. So yeah, I mean, there's just wasn't that. And it is my experience, and I obviously that's why I gravitate toward wrestlers like Bret Hart or Randy Savage or someone like that, because that's what was in my formidable years, what I got to watch and who I got to see. And that's the thing that and I always get in the weeds, I'm sorry, but that's a thing about wrestling to me that it's such a generational thing. You would say the best matches I ever saw had, say, Jack Briscoe in them, and then I'm going to say, the best matches I ever saw had Bret Hart in them. My son, God bless him, he's going to say the best matches I ever saw had Kenny Omega in them, and I'm going to sit there and go, Kenny Omega, what are you talking about? But you have to think about it just like music. It's like I always tell my wife, they don't make new music for old people. Music's the same way. It's that evolution of the art. But I find myself jealous of territory guys, because once I go back and now and later in life and have watched it all, it's like, man, I wish I would have been there for that.
Well, the wrestling was great too, but you got to realize too, the world was in a different place. And, you hear the old cliche, and it's a really brutal cliche about smoky arenas and shit like that. But it was legit. You would show up, and I can tell you, one of the highlights for me on Wednesday nights and going to the matches in Miami was seeing the same people sitting ringside week after week. So I spent 10 years seeing the same faces every Wednesday night. I knew which vendor to go to get the best slice of pizza. You know what I mean? Right. There were all these little details, and the wrestling was great. The wrestling obviously was the attraction and what brought us to the building. At the same time, there's all these little intangibles that go along with it. My dad and I would go out to eat prior. We would go to the newsstand and get the latest wrestling magazines. We knew where the wrestlers were entering into the building if I wanted to get autographs. So there were all these little things to it. So when I thought about going to wrestling on a Wednesday night, it wasn't always that I'm going to see, let's say, a Jack Briscoe match or Dusty Rhodes or whoever. It was like, I'm going to get a large popcorn tonight. I'm going to get ice cream. I'll see some good wrestling. Dusty's going to bleed, and I know that. But there were so many things. And the generational aspect, you're 100% correct. The wrestling you grew up with, in most cases, is always going to be your favorite. Mm-hmm. It's just, and even now, I look back and I can, I've been doing the podcast with my co-host, Jeff Baldrin, for over 3.5 years. Never missed a fucking episode, by the way. Just clearly want to point out that we are 185 episodes that have delivered every Tuesday morning without missing one. I have never done anything like that in my life. We're so constant at 180 episodes, 185 episodes, whatever the number is.
It's awesome.
Yeah, it's insane actually when I stop and think about it. But wrestling is generational, and part of our listener group, they're younger than we are. You're younger than I am, Nate. Though we don't really look too much different. I got to be honest, but, except for you're a little darker in the beard aspect.
Ohio takes its toll. I didn't have that Florida sun my whole life. Sorry.
This is Philadelphia sun you're looking at now. So.
Yeah, there goes my excuse.
Yeah, but my DNA, as my dermatologist always tells me, your DNA has been mutated. Completely. My parents, at my age, when my parents took me out in the sun, that whole skin cancer, there was none of that. Like, it was just like, yeah, bring the kid out, he gets a sunburn, whatever. But I'm very fortunate that I have no issues. But the point I was trying to make before I got off topic, which I frequently do, is people in our Facebook group are demographically much younger than Jeff and myself. And they'll look back fondly on the WWE that they grew up with. Some are roughly your age, some are a little bit younger, but they look back through these rose-colored glasses. It's because what they saw. A lot of those matches were horrific, and I mean terrible. Guys like Bret Hart, Randy Savage, Shawn Michaels were the balance to what could be a really horrific fucking card, but then you would throw in one or two good matches, in some cases a great match. But these same people that criticize current wrestling, and AEW is a huge target. If you're going to tell me that the WWF from 30 or 35 years ago is better than the current AEW product, you clearly need to pull your head out of your rectum. and I say that with the utmost respect, but that's what I was alluding to. You look at what you grew up with rose-colored glasses. You can do nothing wrong. Even the fucking Doink versus Crush match was the greatest match ever because you have a great memory of it.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. Like I look back now, and I there's another thing I'm glad of. I'm glad I was young and dumb in the 80s, like a little kid, because you're right. I mean, watching a bloated Dino Bravo, lumber around the ring with an uninspired Greg Valentine is not good stuff. The stuff that I look the most fondly on is the stuff probably 5 years prior to and up to the Attitude Era. I really loved, especially my favorite thing in wrestling, and we're getting off topic, but my favorite year in wrestling is the WWF in 1997 for me, with the Bret Hart heel run and Steve Austin on the rise and all of that. It was just, to me, that is a year that I can go back and just watch from beginning to end in that promotion. Because I was never a WCW guy. I guess I was a WWF guy back then during the Monday Night Wars. WCW was fine, but that like you said, it's what you grew up with, it's what you watched, and that's what shapes your fandom. And then hopefully as you get older, you can expand your fandom, and like I said, that's what I've gone back and done. I wish there was more Florida for me to watch, to be honest with you.
And there's Florida out there, certainly in our Facebook group, and I will give the very cheap plug right now. It is the Championship Wrestling from Florida Archives Facebook group. We've got 8,400 members. We've been in existence for over 7 years. I think it's coming up on our 8th year. Prior to that, I actually had a website, which was the CWF Archives website. I discontinued it with in Facebook. You can do something very similar, and it's interactive, so it's a lot more fun in that regard. But we post a lot of videos. There's somebody that posts a video per day. But if you do search YouTube, there is, in the last 2 years, a lot more has become available. And one of the things, when you look at the old Florida wrestling too, was the realism of the product that was being put out. You can watch guys like Buddy Cole and Paul Jones, in the middle of the ring, and you would swear on a stack of Bibles that these guys they legitimately hate each other and going to kill each other.
Right.
This wasn't acting. These punches, you would say to yourself, this is a worked punch. Paul Jones, his punches, the guy was an amateur boxer, but he knew how to throw a punch. You would just, you would go, there's just no way that this isn't legit. This is believable.
Mm-hmm. Would you say he had a better punch than Lawler?
No, I wouldn't. But you know what? That's a very good comparison. It's a very similar type of punch.
Okay.
I've always felt Lawler had one of the best. Paul Jones, Bob Cook, and Bob Cook is another one that doesn't get the credit. But Bob Cook's punches were through the roof. But you look at some of the really horrific punches that have been out there through the years. So when you see a good punch, you're definitely going to appreciate it.
And what a lot of people don't realize about Florida is how, what do I want to say? You have a progression here that runs into at least the early 80s NWA WCW, because Cowboy Luttrell to Eddie Graham to Dusty Rhodes, and then Dusty's influence comes into the national promotions with the NWA, and that's the other thing I was going to ask you. One of the things I wanted to ask you, and I'm sure this is one of those questions you're going to say, Nate, this is one of the questions people always ask me, but I want to ask anyway, just because this goes back again to my fandom. I loved Dusty Rhodes, even as a little kid. Who couldn't? The charisma was insane. But what I saw of Dusty Rhodes was Dusty Rhodes from probably, what did I say, 83. So I probably discovered the NWA in 85 or 86 at 7 or 8 years old until his passing. So there's my Dusty Rhodes until I started going back into the territories. So my question, because I'm fascinated, because I'm a fan of his, how cool was that to be there when Dusty was at his possibly his peak? Granted, nationally, Dusty Rhodes, the NWA champion, 86, 87, what have you, but during that time in Florida would you say, arguably his best stuff?
Oh yeah, I mean, without a doubt, his best stuff would have occurred. So Dusty turned babyface in May of 1974, and prior to the Dusty turn, it had been a build where Dusty was this really popular heel. And he was popular because even though Dusty was a big guy, he moved with lightning speed. That certainly went away by the time you were watching him. But he was vibrant. He was exciting. He was charismatic. He was great in the ring. There was so much that Dusty could do. And what I think happened within 2 to 3 years of that babyface turn, because I was there. I was there from when Dusty was a heel up until essentially Dusty left the state and went to Crockett. And Dusty was initially, even I was very excited, especially in the 75, 74, 75, 76, because you knew that Dusty was never boring. At the end of the day, you were going to get, even though I wasn't paying for my tickets, you were going to get your money's worth.
Right.
And everybody understood that. The issue, and this is my perspective on it, and I bet you could find a million people that would disagree with me in a heartbeat, and probably even in my own Facebook group, you would find a lot of people who disagree with me. But as somebody who was there, the formula for Dusty got old. And at some point, I started, I just, even as a 12 and 13-year-old, I could telegraph what was going to happen that night, what the main event was going to be with Dusty. And that's not something, that I think that's bad when that happens to business. I think when you can start to say, yeah, we're going to see this. And, it was much more exciting to me to see maybe a Jack Briscoe match, to reference what you said earlier, only because I didn't always know what the outcome was going to be. Right. With Dusty, you knew Dusty wasn't doing a clean pinfall. Dusty hadn't done clean pinfalls in years. Dusty did not do clean pinfalls. So if Dusty lost, it was going to be by disqualification. There was also a 95% chance, maybe even greater, that Dusty was going to bleed. And I think when wrestling becomes too predictable, part of the fun is taken out. So to answer your question in a very long-winded, roundabout way, yes, there were points when it was exciting, and Dusty, make no mistake, Dusty was the guy that people wanted to see. Mm-hmm. Dusty was the guy that sold tickets and put asses in seats. For me, it didn't always work that way.
Well, and here we go with the generation thing again. That was, I think, what you're describing that I did not get to see with Dusty was honestly the same thing that happened to the Hulk Hogan formula in the WWF in the 80s going into the early 90s. Okay, it worked like gangbusters for about 3 years, Vince. But now we're beating a dead horse here. Okay, Hogan's going to have the monster heel, and then Hogan's going to fight the monster. And that was bred into Vince by his dad. The way they booked the territory in New York and that. But yeah, that's triggers something in my head there. A great comparison between, this guy can be all charisma, but if you book it into oblivion, was he booking himself then? Was he the booker in Florida?
In the beginning, he wasn't. Guys like Bill Watts, but Dusty essentially was. I don't know if I could say booking himself, but certainly was coming up with a lot of his own finishes. And, the idea, and I get it, the idea was to always protect Dusty because he was your drawing card. He was the guy. You got to realize, too, if you look at, let's say, the top 5 baby faces in the U.S. from the period 1975 to 1980, Andre the Giant, maybe Bruno Sammartino, Dusty Rhodes, guys like this. Dusty was essentially the cornerstone of the state. The promotion, for the most part, was drawing 4,000 people per night to the buildings, except for Jacksonville, which would draw maybe 8,000, give or take. And then they did a monthly card in St. Petersburg that might do somewhere in the same neighborhood. But on a weekly basis, Miami, Tampa, they're doing roughly 4,000, give or take. So for Dusty to commit to being in the state when he could be headlining Madison Square Garden. He was headlining Houston, Atlanta. He was all over the country.
Oh, and they brought him into the WWF to do the run with Billy Graham.
Absolutely. Yeah. But they had amazing chemistry together. But for Dusty to commit to staying in the state, and he would leave but come back, and if he got injured, Kevin Sullivan spikes him, whatever it is.
Right.
Dusty leaves and he comes back in 2 weeks. But we also saw a period where if Dusty was gone for any length of time, and I can give you a couple. I'll give you 3 examples actually. One was 1979 Sweet Brown Sugar. 19 in Sweet Brown Sugar was Skip Young. 1980 was Paul Jones as Mr. Florida, and then 1982 was Butch Reed, Hacksaw. All 3 drew extremely well, and I think in my head, part of it had to do with it was a new baby face to get behind because we had seen the Dusty Rhodes formula. Again, take me out of it. But I think for the average fan, if you had gone to every show in Miami for a year, there's 50 to 51 shows. They usually take off 1 week out of the year. Dusty's probably on 40 of those shows. You're seeing that similar formula 40 times a year in the same city. So when a guy like Butch Reed is a great example, Butch Reed came in, Butch Reed was on fire. But more importantly, I didn't just like Butch Reed. Butch Reed was drawing, and Butch Reed was putting asses in seats. In Miami, a town that had done 3,500 to 4,500 on a weekly basis was now doing over 5,000. Sometimes upwards of 6,000. He was outdrawing Dusty. Now, there could be a lot of reasons. Maybe the economy, gas shortages. There's always a lot of reasons. At the same time, Dusty came back after his sabbatical of being gone for a few months, and Butch Reed's push was then downgraded. And we interviewed Butch, and we asked him about that. And to his credit, Dusty dead. Butch, unfortunately, has passed on since, but Butch still didn't want to say anything negative about Dusty. That being said, a guy like Paul Jones had no problem saying something negative about Dusty, and went on a four-letter word tirade and calling Dusty all kinds of names, saying I was the number one babyface. I was drawing. People were vested in my programs with Sir Oliver Humperdinck and the Super Destroyer. Dusty came back, and he's this motherfucker, Dusty, and he's calling him all these names, and basically saying that was it. Dusty comes back, and 2 weeks later, I'm out of the state. I'm gone. And Butch and Skip Young, I never had the chance, but by the same token, Skip Young did extremely well. Fans were Skip Young with the mask on was a totally different guy, and fans were so into what he was doing. He became the top babyface in the state.
You mentioned a name that I actually have down here to ask you about, because a lot of our listeners you just talked about your podcast listeners being maybe a little younger than you. A lot of ours are either the same age or a little younger than us. So a lot of people are not going to know. Again, you talk about generationally. Guess what I saw as a younger person of Oliver Humperdinck? I saw him in the WWF with Bam Bam Bigelow. I saw WCW dress him up as what was a biker, Big Daddy Dink or whatever it was, all that. Can you impart to our listeners how good Oliver Humperdinck was as a manager in Florida during the territory?
Absolutely. Then after that, I'm going to circle back to talk about a wrestler that I just mentioned that was, I think, one of the best ever, but most people only know him from a horrible, horrible managerial stint in Crockett. Sir Oliver Humperdinck, if you were in the state of Florida, and I would imagine people in Los Angeles or Montreal also got a really good taste. He was arguably the best manager I ever saw. Now, a lot of people will give that credit and they'll say, well, Bobby Heenan was the best, or Jim Cornette. And the name Humperdinck never really comes up. And I think a lot of that has to do with that horrible run where he was the manager of Bam Bam Bigelow, or his later stint, where was he even a manager for the, he was, it was more just part of what the Freebirds were doing or whatever.
Yeah, whatever act. Yeah, they had him with the SST for a minute and doing that. And but like you said, he was never really a manager. He was just part of a larger act.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'll tell you what, babyface managers almost never get over. To me, it's the kiss of death. Humperdinck was great because Humperdinck, in the state of Florida too, Humperdinck was a guy much like Jimmy Hart was in Memphis. It's almost a similar pattern that you're not going to always remember who he managed, but you're going to remember he was there. And if a big heel was coming into Florida, Humperdinck was the guy. And Humperdinck would leave and come back. But for the most part, Humperdinck spent 13 years in the state of Florida. Yes, he would leave. He spent time in Crockett. Dory Funk Jr. was a big fan of Humperdinck's work. But Humperdinck was great because, A, wasn't afraid to get involved in a match, but then take a beating. He loved the blade. He would bleed. But his interview style was fantastic. So he had this flaming red hair, which was natural, white skin, and he would work himself up into a lather, and his eyes would bulge like he had like a thyroid condition. Like his eyes are bulging out of his head, but his skin would turn beet red just like his hair. And he would get himself, and he would lose his voice. He was just so believable and so great. And there are periods where he's the top heel in the state. I mean, above whoever he's managing, more people wanted to kill Humperdinck. And that's really a testament to doing a great job. They did turn him babyface in 1980, and it worked. It was because it was a short-term deal. They didn't alter his personality. They didn't bring him in as a babyface manager with a cane or a sequin fucking jacket. But he was the same guy, now just going after heels. And it worked. But the genius of also understanding that was it's short term. This is not something we're going to do. And then he turned back heel after just a few months.
Okay.
But he was absolutely fantastic. I would rate him as in the top 3 managers that I ever saw of all time. There no doubt were guys before me, before my time. Gentleman Saul Weingeroff, I've heard was fantastic. J.C. Dykes,
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of guys that I never had the chance to see.
What was the guy in Memphis? Sam Bass. I've always
I
heard that.
saw Sam Bass. So
Did
Sam
you?
Bass.
Okay. See, I've never seen Sam Bass.
Oh, he was fantastic. He was Sam Bass was with us in the summer, I guess spring to fall of 1975, and he was managing a Mass team in Florida called the Mass Superstars, which were Jerry Lawler and Don Green.
Okay.
And Sam Bass was just another guy. What made Sam Bass great was understanding how to get people to hate him. And that's, the psychology of wrestling is everything, obviously, at least it used to be. And Sam Bass could walk to the ring and just people wanted to kill him at that stage. Fantastic manager. But there were a lot of guys that, a guy like Sam Bass, he died in 75 or 76.
Right.
A guy like Saul Weingeroff, never on a big stage and out of doing smaller promotions by the 70s, not in the bigger promotions, but people will rave about his work. But there was a slew of guys going back in the early 70s and into the 60s that there's no footage. We have no context to know how great these were other than talking to ringsiders who were there and actually saw them.
And that's one of the great things. I think one of the great, and I will get back to, because I know who you were going to discuss, but that's one of the great things to me about the internet. I'm so glad that we have it because you sometimes, as a wrestling fan, discovering something new that you never knew was there is one of the coolest things in the world. I'll give an example. I started watching for probably the third or fourth time in my life, but I started watching Smoky Mountain Wrestling from beginning to end again.
Sure.
It's one of the, I can go back and watch it anytime. But what it did is one night it got me, Smoky Mountain Wrestling on the computer and a little bit of beer, and you go down the wormhole. And I watched hours of Ron Wright on YouTube.
Yep.
What a fucking heel. That guy, I was unaware. Like, all I ever knew of Ron Wright was he was the guy in Smoky Mountain in the wheelchair with the blanket on his legs and et cetera, et cetera. And I go down this wormhole and discover this heel that's like, God, I wish this guy was around, when I was watching wrestling when I was a kid. What a great heel. But yeah, I mean, just going down a wormhole like that is a great thing for a fan, I think. And discover things, people. Don't stay in your lane. Discover things.
Ron Wright's best days were in the 70s. In what he was doing with the chisel in the Knoxville territory. But he was another one that would, he'd come out of arenas and his tires had been slashed and he'd been shot at.
And when you watch him, why. You can see why when you watch him, because he's so convincing. And so it's like, God, this guy's an asshole, and just such a good heel. You were going to bring up Paul Jones, weren't you?
Of course I was. So this is something, there are several things. There are several triggers that I have. And we can talk about one in a few minutes, and I'll throw it out there now and then just remind me. But Mike Graham never drew a dime. So remind me of that one in a little bit, because I like that one as well. But Paul Jones, and this is for people that saw Paul Jones as a manager in Crockett, I thought he was terrible.
I did too.
I don't know how much of that was his fault. And I liked Paul. Paul and I were actually working on his autobiography for years, and I still have 20 chapters of it. So I never liked him as a manager. I never thought it worked. And that's how people know. And Paul Jones sucked. And at that point, I want to grab somebody by the throat and say, you saw Paul Jones as essentially a lame duck manager. He was Dusty hated Paul Jones. Paul Jones hated Dusty even more. But Paul was kept around Crockett because he had been part of Crockett for years, for decades. And this was out of loyalty. Paul Jones as a wrestler was as believable as anyone who has ever stepped into the ring. And I saw Paul Jones in 72 through 74. Paul Jones had a baby face and heel run in the state of Florida, started off as a heel and became a baby face. And it lasted 2.5 years. And it was kind of that bridging the gap between Jack Briscoe and Dusty Rhodes. You look at the three greatest baby faces in the state of Florida, it's Eddie Graham, Eddie Graham, essentially it cuts down on his hours, and it goes to Jack Briscoe. And Jack Briscoe now becomes the big baby face. Jack Briscoe becomes the world champion. Dusty Rhodes takes over and does that. And then you can argue in the 80s, Barry Windham, whoever it was. But the point was, it really went from Eddie Graham to Jack Briscoe to Dusty Rhodes. Paul Jones was the top babyface in the state after Jack Briscoe and before Dusty.
Okay.
And literally, by the time that Dusty was turning babyface, Paul was already out of the state. Paul Jones in the early 70s, especially, I'll say 72 going into 73, was in kind of this feud. It was a triad of three guys, and it was Paul Jones, Buddy Colt, and Jack Briscoe. And on any given night, it was Paul Jones versus Buddy Colt. The next night, it's Paul Jones versus Jack Briscoe. And the third night, Buddy Colt versus Jack Briscoe. It was almost, they were interchangeable. Those series of matches will probably remain my favorite program from a believability standpoint because, hey, Jack Briscoe was the real deal.
Right.
There's no, you could watch a Jack Briscoe match and Jack retired in 85. You could watch a Jack Briscoe match and you're still going to say this guy's legit.
Right.
Because he was. And that'll never fade.
Right. Transcends time.
Absolutely. Buddy Colt was, he's a Colt favorite. Buddy Colt, whose career ended in 75 with the plane crash. Buddy Colt was he gave the impression of a legit badass. And he could do almost anything in the ring. Throw in Paul Jones, who was another one of the best punches, not afraid to brawl, not afraid to wrestle. These matches were incredible. Paul Jones had every tool to be the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion, with the exception of the fact he was a little short. 5'8", 5'9", somewhere right around there. So he didn't have height. I hate to use another cliche, but if he had been 6'1", I think he would have been in contention to be a world's heavyweight champion. He was that good. So don't let the fedora wearing Paul Jones, whatever that hat was, and the sparkly outfits that Porter Wagoner used to wear on football. Don't let any of that shit fool you. This guy was the real deal in the 70s.
Well, and that's another one of those things. That's why I'm so glad to have you here, because that's why I wanted to dig into this, because again, that's the Paul Jones that I saw. I've seen a little bit of before like the tail end of his career in Mid-Atlantic before he became a manager.
Sure.
But that's it. I haven't seen a lot of Paul Jones from the 70s, so now here I go tonight. Maybe that's what I'll dig into. Maybe I'll go check that out.
Stage. I don't want to even take away, even if Mid-Atlantic was good. But so we're getting a special guest right now. There he is. Oz, you say hi? Say hi, Oz. So
he doesn't want to
join me.
It's always nice to have company. Have somebody for support,
This is it. It's my soulmate, as I tell everyone. This is my soulmate right here. So
okay. Well, hold on. Let me ask you a question. Or let me make a statement, Barry. Mike Graham never drew a dime.
So this is one that generally sets me off big time. And the people who say Mike Graham never drew a dime, and I really want to quantify this and look at all sides of it, because workers have said it. The people that say it have no fucking idea what they're talking about because they weren't there. And I think a lot of this I'm going to put on the shoulders of Big Clumsy Kevin Nash. He, I believe, came out and called Mike a vanilla midget and said Mike Graham never drew a dime. And let's say in WCW, they'd be absolutely correct. Right. Nobody was watching WCW to watch Mike Graham. I was a guy that was in the arenas. I spent the majority of my childhood, beginning in 1971 up into the 80s, again, 1 to 3 times per week. One time I saw 5 cards in 1 week.
Wow.
We did a tour of the state. Mike Graham drew a lot of fucking dimes. He drew a lot of fucking money. And there are parrots on social media that say Mike Graham was a vanilla midget. Again, parroting what Big Clumsy, Big Doofus had said. Or Mike Graham never drew a dime, which he also said, and I believe Missy Hyatt said, though Missy said it more as a joke. Mike Graham drew a lot of dimes. You might not like Mike Graham. You might have an issue with the way, because I know he had an issue with guys like Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit, and there was a lot of issues. I get it. You don't like the guy. I have zero issue with that. You don't have to like him. But if you're going to say he never drew a dime when Mike put a lot of asses into seats, that is so contextually incorrect that I call people out for it all the time. Show me your proof he never drew a dime, because I was fucking there and I saw it.
Well, and not to mention, the person making this statement was the lowest drawing WWF champion in history. So, I mean, let's be honest, Mr. Nash, you weren't exactly putting the asses in the seats either. And I don't know. Yeah, it's a stupid statement to make, especially again.
Let me give Kevin Nash credit too. This is something I have to give him a lot of credit for. This guy made millions of dollars in professional wrestling with the most marginal talent that I may have ever seen. And he's not a good worker.
No.
Sloppy, clumsy. If he's not injuring himself, he's injuring somebody else. But politically, this is one of the brightest guys I think ever to work in wrestling. And a guy with really super marginal talent made not only a career, but millions of dollars. That takes something, and that's where I'll give him credit for.
Right. But what I will say is I still stand by the fact he made a lot of money. He made a lot of money as part of a group with Hulk Hogan and Scott Hall around him. And I'm not discounting his charisma or anything, but if I take Kevin Nash, and again, he's solely the guy that is carrying the company on his back. Because if anybody, I WWF stuff, I'll go on about it forever. Like I know it by heart. His top time to be on his own as the top guy in a company. He drew for shit. He was the worst drawing champion Vince ever had. And he drew with the NWO as part of the NWO. He didn't draw as Kevin Nash. He drew as, so, I mean, I know you were giving him a little credit there, but I have to take a little bit of the credit back because anytime he was the top guy on his own, he didn't draw.
It's not the only credit I'm giving him is that he was bright enough
to put himself in that position.
To put himself in a position where a guy who fucking tears his quad just stepping over the ropes became a multi-millionaire.
Yeah.
Like that to me, that's where that's a big thing. Like this guy really, what a bright guy. At the same time, I don't think Kevin Nash was a wrestling fan prior to getting into wrestling.
No.
Not at all. He did it because he saw an end to a means of making a lot of money. And again, very successful. To say Mike Graham never drew a dime is so incorrect. I can show you stats. I mean, I would love nothing more. And I know, this will never happen. I would love to have some sort of forum where I could debate somebody like Kevin Nash. On something like this. People on Facebook will post all the time and I'll see it and it'll be, Mike Graham never drew a dime. Show me your source. Kevin Nash said it in an interview with someone,
Right.
Okay, right.
Yeah. Kevin Nash said in an interview in some hotel room in
exactly.
Tampa.
He's being paid by like Rob Feinstein for a fucking shoot thing in a hotel room. Exactly.
And shoot interviews, they crack me up. They crack me up because people take them to heart and they don't realize you're talking to a professional wrestler.
They're not talking anymore.
Yes.
It's all a work.
Everything's a work. And, I don't believe a story until I see like 4 different people tell the same story the same way. Other than that, they're working the shoot guy, getting their money. And that's fine. That's great. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. A couple of things I wanted to ask you before we wrap it up was a guy that I wanted to ask about in Florida because he's one of my favorite heels of all time. I almost no one as a heel to me personally can compare to Don Morocco as a heel.
Sure.
If Don Morocco, if I see something that has Don Morocco on it as a bad guy, I'm watching it because the guy was fantastic. What was it? When did he work in Florida? And what was what was it like to see him in Florida? I guess is my question.
Don Morocco was the fucking man. So I wasn't a huge fan of what he was doing up north because at that point he was bigger, he was slower, and they were kind of playing off that, with the meatball sandwich and all that,
right,
in the match. But we saw Don Morocco for the first time in 1974, and he came in as a babyface, and he was working primarily mid-card, getting some main events, but he was brought in, and there was a comparison to Jack Briscoe.
Okay.
And, it was a lot of people were of the impression that, they're similar in stature, the same hairstyle. Obviously, Don looks Hawaiian, Jack didn't.
Right.
But there was a big comparison. And then there was a match that took place probably within 3 or 4 months of Don being in the state where he filled in for someone, and it escapes me who he filled in for. And he wrestled Jack Briscoe and almost beat Jack Briscoe for the NWA World's Heavyweight title. And it was kind of like this is what made Don Morocco in the state of Florida. Before that, he might have been in tag matches or doing other stuff, but almost beating Jack Briscoe, and he reversed the figure 4 was a big deal. This was a big deal. His career was made. He came back in 77. In 77 was such a great run for him because he came back as this tough, kick-ass babyface. And Don Morocco was tough. Here was a guy that would go out, he would bleed, he would sweat, spit coming out of his mouth. He didn't give a shit. He was out there to kick some ass, and that's what we saw. It conveyed to the crowd, to the public. So Don Morocco, to me, legit, absolutely a legit guy, and had some great feuds. Ivan Koloff, Killer Carl Cox, Lars Anderson had these great feuds. Then he disappeared, and we didn't see Don Morocco, but mysteriously in 1979, a guy showed up called the Magnificent M wearing a mask, and was only around for like 2 weeks, and the mask came off on television. Steve Kern took off the mask, and lo and behold, it was a bald Don Morocco. And at that point, Don went on what is a legendary heel run in the state of Florida that lasted, and at a different level. Anything Don Morocco did in the state of Florida was Hall of Fame worthy. No exceptions to it. He was money every single night.
Awesome. It's funny because I do the other show with Chad Austin from ECW and Aaron, Reliving the Extreme, where we're going through ECW from the humble beginnings till the very end of Extreme. And it's funny because Don Morocco comes in, he's in there at the beginning. And I mean, he's fat, he's slow. He's, obviously he's just there to get his indie paycheck and go. He doesn't give a shit. But man, I contest to those guys every time we see him, still the promo's there. Even when he doesn't give a shit in the ring, I can still sit and watch that promo because I love a Don Morocco promo. What a heel. Just I get excited when I talk about Don Morocco as a heel.
Even to that end, as I look at that, if Don's never going to wrestle another match, but if Don showed up at an indie show to wrestle a match, I know what that would be. That would be maybe Don throwing a punch. I would still go to the fucking show.
Yeah.
Just to see Don Morocco.
Exactly.
Understanding the limitations, I would still want to see him. In his heyday, though, and if you can find that on YouTube in Florida, there are some Don Morocco matches. They're phenomenal. Don had it. He had it all. There wasn't anything that Don Morocco couldn't do. Nothing.
I say, and I've had this conversation with others that, on the show and stuff. I say he's one of those guys where they always say, give me a guy that should have been a world champion, and he's always on my list. I think even if for a brief time as an NWA heel champion, I think Don Morocco could have pulled that off aces.
The problem with the NWA, I think the WWF was more conducive. I would have had him as maybe, why the Iron Sheik? Why not Don Morocco?
Right. Yeah.
I don't understand the thought process, but give him the belt, have him do it for a month, whatever it is. The NWA was very the old boy network, and I have to, he's Hawaiian. I'd have to think that's the only reason they didn't. As stupid as that sounds right now, granted that Hawaii has been a state for years, but for whatever reason, the NWA was such an old boy network that I don't think they were going to put the world title on a Hawaiian. Is the only excuse that I can think of, because again, Don Morocco was it. He was it.
My last question for you, sir, about Florida. What would you say was the hottest angle you ever got to witness in that territory?
Absolutely. And this is great. I'm glad you asked that, because this is going to lead into a plug for my fan fest as well. So I was really fortunate in that I saw a lot of great angles. There were some that were mind-blowingly great that were cut off at the knees and not understanding at the time why they might, why aren't these guys working with whatever it might be. There was an angle in 1976 that was revolutionary, I think, in professional wrestling, and it drew, and I'll go through the steps. So Bob Roop and Steve Keirn. Steve Keirn had not yet exploded as a big star. He was part of a tag team with a future WWF world champion in Backlund. They were the Florida tag team champions. And Steve Keirn was essentially a middle card guy or in a tag team. He wasn't working main events.
Right.
And Bob Roop at that point had been the Florida champion. He had been a top guy in Florida for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years. About a year and a half, I take it back. And he was transitioning from a solo main event heel to part of a faction with Bob Orton Sr. and Bob Orton Jr.
Okay.
And they were talking, Steve Keirn was talking about his dad. And Steve Keirn's dad, a little backstory, was a prisoner of war and had just come back to the States 2 or 3 years earlier. I want to say it was 72 or 73 he came back. But he had been a prisoner of war for many years. There's books out there about this. And if you Google Colonel Richard Keirn, you can get the backstory. So Gordon and Steve are talking about how his dad is a hero. He's a war hero. And Bob Roop comes out, he's the next interview, and says, I don't understand this. He goes, he's not a hero. Anybody that's been captured twice and been a prisoner of war is a coward. Now, you've got to realize, this is 1976. So there's no internet. If you want to research Colonel Richard Keirn, you're going to have to find a library that's got some information. So the world was a lot smaller because of not having the internet. So saying something so inflammatory like that is not just going to get, Colonel Richard Keirn's family upset. It's going to get fans upset. Got to realize, too, that we also have an Air Force base in Tampa. It's a military town. So Bob says this. The next thing you know, Steve Keirn comes flying out, jumps over the desk, and attacks Roop. It's on fire. When Steve does that, his ankle hits the camera mount.
Okay.
So his ankle swells up. He can't walk, but he's beating the shit out of Roop. Gordon Soley is doing what Gordon Soley does best. We're going to break, and he's frantic. He's freaking out. We got to get order restored. And they come back, and the next thing you know, Keirn's at the desk, and he's he's literally got tears in his eyes. Like this is not an interview. Like this is a guy that you've just fucking called his father, a prisoner of war, twice, a coward. He's livid. It's unbelievable. This transcends wrestling. And that was the key with it. This wasn't a normal wrestling angle. This transcended whatever they were trying to do. These two fought in every city in Florida, in every type of match for the next 5 months. That's a long time to have a program. So in Miami, we saw their grudge match. Then we saw the return grudge match. Then we saw a tag team match where maybe, he's got Backlund and Roop's got Orton Jr. Then the next week is a Texas death match. Then it's a steel cage match. It went on for 5 months, but it drew. And the key with this was, Eddie Graham was a genius. Love him or hate him, faults, no faults, whatever it is, nobody will ever deny his wrestling acumen. It existed. So on a weekly basis, these guys are drawing without Dusty. These guys are drawing for these kinds of matches. And then they moved to smaller towns and they repeated the cycle in these tiny little towns that nobody's ever even heard of. They went on for 5 months and it was just the most compelling, realistic angle you would ever see. So we had a chance, and this was our third Fan Fest to relive the angle. So we headlined our third Fan Fest with Steve Keirn and Root. And we brought them together for the first time in years. And the genesis was, we're going to talk about your careers. We're going to do a Q&A. Let's talk about this angle. And I actually got the audio. Can't find the video, but I actually got the audio to the angle and we played it. And then both guys could commentate on it. And I got to tell you, this was one of those moments as a wrestling fan that really meant a lot. And Bob Roop, if you've never met him, just one of the nicest, warmest human beings. Wrestling, not wrestling, life. This guy's it. I love Bob Roop till no end. He's a great friend of mine. I talk to him all the time. I just love him. He's just such a great person. Bob, if I asked Bob to come down for the next Fan Fest, Bob would say, Bob doesn't even ask me how much. There's not, when do you need me and I'll be there. That's the relationship. Steve Keirn said, I have a hard stop at 7:30 and I've got to be out of the building. So 7:28 comes along and I'm doing the moderating for this whole show.
Right.
And I'm like, Steve, I know you've got to go. I've got one more question. And Steve goes, it's only 7:30. I can stick around for another hour. And that was so great because he was so vested into this conversation with Roop and about this angle and what had occurred 45 years ago that he didn't want to go anywhere.
That's awesome.
And that really said a lot to me. Like that really meant, a lot to me. So again, long-winded, roundabout answer to your question. Bob Roop versus Steve Keirn. And I did an article. I wrote an article years ago for the old Kayfabe Memories website. And then I updated it. But I was able to get quotes from Roop, Keirn, and Jody Hamilton. Jody Hamilton, the original assassin, was also the booker during this period when this angle was taking place. He gives all the credit to Roop and Keirn, but at the same time, he was the guy in charge. And then I was able to list all of their matches that I was able to document, which is probably 90 or 95%. And there's probably 100 matches between these two, which is just incredible. Yeah. So that's where I would go. I would go Roop, Keirn. But again, there were so many great programs and great angles that occurred on a monthly basis, sometimes on a weekly basis, that it could be difficult to choose.
Well, that is definitely true. And I think we've just scratched the surface of this iceberg that we could probably go on and talk more. So I first of all, I want to thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
I'm here for the cheeseburgers. Let's get
yes. And thank you for not asking for the really, really expensive gourmet cheeseburgers. I appreciate that
Right.
too. But also, I would love to have you back on sometime to dig into more of this, Barry. And is there anything you would like to shamelessly plug before we? I'm a shameless plugger myself. So, is there anything you'd like to plug before we?
Yeah, so good. This will take about 30 minutes, and I'll start to knock all this out. But anytime you want me back, it's, every time I do an interview or I talk to people about CWF, it's almost like, okay, you've talked for 4 hours, we got to go now. And it's like, I could talk all night long. I love it. It's my passion. It's my hobby. So I would be more than happy to come back. But yes, let me do a little plugging. So the Breaking Kayfabe with Baldwin and Barry podcast, we don't just discuss wrestling. We discuss everything underneath the sun. We discuss life. If you like movies, music, television, food is a huge topic. We do get wrestling in all the time. We have a guest on this past week, Lily Hayden. Lily was the youngest daughter in the Rodney Dangerfield movie, Easy Money. And she is now a concert violinist. She is tremendous. She was a great guest, but we've had on Butch Reed, Dory Funk Jr., Stan Hansen, Jerry Briscoe, Steve Kern, Bob Roop, Ron Fuller. We've had on maybe 100 wrestling guests, but we've also had on punk rock musicians. We've had on actors, actresses. So we're very diverse. We're not a family-friendly podcast. There's a lot of profanities and other things that are tossed out, but we're very inclusive. So I have a lot of fun, and I think we just knocked out. It's 184, 185 episodes. Never missed a week. We did do an epic, and I mean fucking epic, 3-part interview with Jimmy Garvin. That is, and it's not us.
I love that.
I feel a robot can do interviews sometimes, but it's the guest. And fucking Jimmy Garvin was just on fire. He's fantastic. But we drop every Tuesday about roughly 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Episodes go anywhere between 1 and 2 hours. Please join us. We also have a Facebook group. It's the Breaking Kayfabe with Baldwin and Barry Facebook group. And lastly, if you are interested in CWF, we have a Facebook page. It is the Championship Wrestling from Florida Archives Facebook page. We have been documenting the history of wrestling in the state very deeply for the last 8 years. You will learn a lot. And then my last will be the Fan Fest. So obviously the pandemic and COVID-19 has put a lot of these things on hold with vaccines, as long as it's not the Johnson & Johnson vaccine.
Yeah.
But if you're Moderna or Pfizer and you've taken the vaccine, travel is in the cards for this year for a lot of people. We are tentatively looking at doing a Fan Fest in November.
Awesome.
And I would think that as we enter into the fall and into the winter, that between testing, vaccines, awareness, that our country, as we're seeing, is already opening. And really, it's, I'm somebody who's in the restaurant industry, and I can tell you the months of January and February versus the month of March, it's like a whole different world. So April will be great. We'll continue to grow. Keep your fingers crossed that we can run again in November. We have a great time. Our Fan Fest is unlike any other Fan Fest you've ever been to. And just so I can quantify that, because I realize promoters toss out bullshit 24/7. It's the nature of the beast. Ours is not a family. It's not a Fan Fest. It's generally considered more of a family get together. We limit to 200 tickets. So you're not standing in line trying to get an autograph for an hour. And then it's a 30-second meet and greet. We encourage all of our people to have meaningful conversations with our guests. And they do. They walk out and they were like, that's the greatest. I just talked for 25 minutes with Barry Windham. Something I heard at our last event. We give you the opportunity. You can get your photo, you can get your autograph. But if you actually want to have a conversation, a meaningful, not a bullshit conversation, ours is the place to be at. So fingers crossed, Nate, we can do it in November.
Sounds great. And I will say, just to testify a little bit here, I am a member of the Archives Facebook group, and I love again looking at history and everything, and your pick of cards that you put up. I love to just go back and look at those. It's just awesome to look at those cards and see who,
I'm putting you on the spot right now, Nate, because I don't recall ever seeing your name commenting on one of those pick a card threads. I am going in tonight and I am specifically going to tag you and look, and you will. And what Nate's talking about is we do on a daily basis at 8 p.m. every night in the Facebook group, we do a pick a card thread. And what it lists is every card that would have taken place on that date. So as we're recording this, which is April 15th, we'll have every card that I can find for April 15th, going back sometimes to the 30s up until the 80s. I think the most we've ever had is 45 cards on one night, but we always average somewhere in the 30s. And it's great for me too, because I even learn stuff in putting these up.
And Pete Letterberg's pictures too. I love,
the best.
Yeah. But yes, everybody join Barry on social media. Definitely check out and I've kind of beat it to death. You probably don't know, but I've been giving you free advertisement. I talk about you guys on our show quite a bit, but
I appreciate it.
Breaking Kayfabe with Bowden and Barry, check it out. You will love it. And that being said, Barry, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. And again, I'd love to have you back sometime soon. Maybe next time we can bring my brother, that rascal, in and see what happens there.